Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 8,000 watt NorthStar generator. This machine I picked up about a year ago for only $100. And at the time I thought I was getting a great deal because this came with a Briggs Vanguard V-twin engine and a low THD generator. So we made a video on it. In that video we got it up and running and making power, and things were looking pretty good until I realized the engine was only running on one cylinder. In the other cylinder, there was a piston rusted in place, a broken connecting rod, and we later found out the crankshaft was also damaged. So that engine, it was a total loss, but I did promise to revisit this in the future if I could find a suitable engine to put in that one's place. So fast forward a year, and we actually have two donor engines. Each of these are Briggs Vanguard V-twin engines, and I believe either one can be used to save that original NorthStar generator. These come to me from two different subscribers, each named Dana. And the story is actually very similar on these machines. I'm told the engines run, that both cylinders have compression, but neither generator makes power. So although it's tempting to just harvest an engine and make that original NorthStar complete, I'm thinking we need to understand why they're not making power, because this could be a simple fix. So let's get the empty frame off the lift. We'll get one of these up in its place and we'll run some tests, see if we can't figure out why it's not making power. So let's start with this one. This is a 7,000 watt Powermate, and I'm told that this machine was running and making power when it suddenly started to smell like an electrical fire, and then it stopped making power. So yeah, not a good sign. It definitely sounds like something melted down, but you never know. We got to run some tests to know for sure. So I'm thinking let's just validate where it's at right now. Let's actually get the engine started and see if we have any output. So I'm going to start actually by getting the tank out of the way. That'll give us a little bit better access, and then we'll feed the carb some fuel and try to fire this thing up. So first things first, let's check the oil. Make sure we have some. And we do. Looks like the line is right there, but the full mark is a little bit lower. So we might be a little bit overfilled, or maybe this is one of those machines you don't screw it in to check. So let's try it like this. And still a little bit overfilled. But the oil actually looks nice and clean. So that is a good sign. And I guess while we're here, let's just double check the airbox. Make sure there's no critter in here and that we do have an air filter. And yeah, nice and clean. Filter looks to be in really good shape. So that is a good sign. So let's hook up some fuel and try to start it. We have a fuel pump right here. This line should be going into the carburetor. And we also have a line down here, or actually we have a fitting for a line. So I'm going to connect up the test tank and maybe plug in a light, and we'll give this thing a few pulls. Let's see what we get. All right, let's give this thing a try. I've got the test tank plumbed in, and I've also got a light plugged in and turned on, as well as this multimeter connected to the 240 out. So let's get the engine started and see what, if anything, we get out of that generator. That was kind of surprising, actually, on two fronts. I guess first off, the engine. It started first pull. It sounds really good, although the carb might need to be cleaned. It was surging a bit. That said, though, the engine, I think, is in pretty good shape. As far as the generator goes, I was really surprised, actually, when that light turned on. According to the kilowatt, we were at 107 volts, about 55 hertz. So I suspect if we brought the engine speed up closer to 61.5 hertz, that voltage would come up as well. That said, though, we're not out of the woods yet on this one. There is actually a strong burning electrical smell in the air. So there is a problem, and I'm willing to bet it's inside that stator. So we do need to run some tests, I think, before getting this started again. And lucky for us, this machine has some quick disconnects on the back of the control panel. So we have the main one here, which is leg 1 and leg 2. So if we unplug this, it will isolate the stator, and we can test directly through these connections. And then we also have two other connections. This one runs over to the idle control, and this, I believe, would be an auxiliary winding, most likely for the idle control. And these wires, they actually do look a little suspicious down here. They almost look crispy and potentially some broken insulation. So we'll have to keep that in mind. Anyway, let's get the multimeter out and see what that tells us. All right, let's start by checking the main windings here. Now, I'm not sure which terminals are leg 1 and leg 2, so we're just going to probe around. And what we should see when we're on one of the legs is a connection between 0.2 and 0.5 ohms. And in this case, we look good, about 0.2, 0.3. And we'll check it to the other leg. No connection there. So that leg appears to be good. So we'll check the other. We should see about the same reading, 0.2, 0.3. And yeah, we're at 0.2, 0.3. So on the surface, at least, the stator seems to be good. Let's check the auxiliary winding. .4, 0.5. So yeah, at least on the surface, everything seems to be good. So let's check these for ground faults. So I'm going to leave one of the leads right here. We'll touch the other one to a source of ground. And we want to make sure we don't have a connection. And in this case, we appear to be good. So we'll go back to here and do the same thing. We'll put a probe in leg 1, and we'll touch the other one down here to ground. And no connection to ground. So we'll check the last leg, same test. One lead on the leg, the other one on ground. And we actually do have a connection. It's a pretty high one, about 13 million ohms, 13 mega ohms, which doesn't seem like a lot. This should run just fine at 13 million ohms, but of course this is a very low voltage test. This meter only puts out about half a volt. So I'm thinking let's break out the Megger. We'll pump some more voltage in here and see if it continues to read high resistance. So I guess before we do the test for real, let me just show you kind of what a good test looks like and what a bad test looks like. Now the wires in the stator, although they look like bare copper, they're actually coated in a varnish, and that insulates the wires from each other as well as the rest of the stator. So normally, if I have one lead connected to ground like I do right now, and the other one to a leg, we should see a very high resistance. So if I crank the handle with this probe attached to nothing, that should demonstrate good insulation, meaning there's no current flowing between the two wires. So that needle went to the left. We're about 500 mega ohms. So like this, there is no short. But if we take this lead and touch it to the engine, and the other lead's also touching the engine, and we do the same test, we should show a short, and this needle will move to the right. So you can see just a little crank on this handle, and we're right at 0 ohms. And that is a short circuit. So that's what we don't want to see when testing that stator. So let's start with the leg that tested well on the low voltage test. So that is in leg 1, and if we crank the handle, the needle should go to the left if the insulation is good. And yeah, we went to 500, between 500 and 1,000 mega ohms. So without a doubt, leg 1, there is no issue there. So I'm going to move this probe over to the suspected bad leg. We're calling that leg 2. And we'll flip this back to 500 volts. And hopefully the needle goes to the left. But it doesn't. It went to the right. And that is a short circuit. And that is why the stator is bad. That's why it's letting out an electrical smell. Unfortunately, the insulation has failed. So now that we know 100% that this stator is bad, this machine can be used as a donor. I have no reservation about separating that generator from the engine and using this engine to make that original NorthStar complete. That said, though, we do have another donor candidate, and that one is also a NorthStar. It's the exact same model as the original, and it's actually in much better shape. So I would rather use that frame if that one ends up being a donor. So I think we need to evaluate that next and then make our decision as far as how to proceed. Actually, before we get that other machine up here on the lift, I think we should separate the generator from the engine. And even before that, I do want to have a quick look at the carb and try to get this running right before we start taking things apart. And I'm not sure how far we're going to get because I don't think I have a rebuild kit for this carb. But I'm hoping if we do a quick clean of the pilot jet, then we might be back in business. Yeah, I think Dana said he did have to go through this real quick just to get it running. That's why this is coming apart so easily. Gasket actually looks pretty good. And the carb doesn't look that bad, all things considered. Needle looks decent. So what I'm after here is the pilot jet. So I'm going to get that out. We'll just make sure it's clear, and then we'll give it a quick try, see if that fixed the surging. The pilot jet looks pretty good, actually. So if it was blocked, it was only just because that needle went right through. So we might have to actually take the whole thing apart to get it running right, but I'm thinking, let's probably wait on that. This is a 14 horse V-twin, and the only reason it's rated at 14 horse is because of the jetting and the carb that's on there. It's actually the same engine that's used on the 16 horse, which is what we need. So we might end up swapping this carb out anyway for one that's jetted a little bit different. So I'm going to get this needle back in, or this jet. We'll get this back together and we'll give it a quick try. And I'm thinking it's probably a good idea to disable this generator before testing it again. Right now it's only a electrical smell, but of course you let it run too long and that can turn into a lot of smoke and potentially a fire. So if we pull one of these brushes, that will effectively disable this so it cannot power up. All right, now that the generator is disabled, I think we should try this again. So I'm hoping we can turn the choke off with that quick clean, although likely we are going to have to go through that carb some more. This time I also have a multimeter connected to these two wires right here. Those are supposed to be connected to the battery, and this does have a voltage regulator. There is a stator behind the flywheel, so I just want to make sure that the charging system actually works on this machine. Okay, good. That is a big improvement. Like last time, the engine started first pull, and I was able to turn the choke off all the way, and the engine ran pretty smooth. So I'm going to call that good for now as far as the carb goes. But we did discover another issue. I didn't see voltage coming out. It was actually negative, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this does actually have a voltage regulator on it. So I'm thinking potentially that might need to sense a load before it'll output power. So I'm going to swap this meter out for a light bulb, get the engine restarted and see if that makes any kind of a difference. And if this doesn't work, we can actually bypass the voltage regulator and connect right to the stator. And that way we can kind of isolate the problem down to which component is causing the problem. Yeah, and still no output. So the light, it did not turn on. And right now we're connected to ground and the other wire up here. And this is supposed to be the power coming from the regulator. Although the regulator output actually goes up to the key switch and then back down. So potentially we could have an issue with that wiring. So I'm thinking let's just pull the red wire off right here. We'll tap into that directly. And if we still have no output, then we'll skip the regulator and go right to the stator output. And this should pull out. There we go. So we'll get one of the leads in there. We want the positive. Okay, let's try that again. And unfortunately, we still have no output from that voltage regulator. So I'm going to connect this back up. And stator wires don't come out very far, but I might be able to get in there. All right, let's try that out. Well, I was beginning to think we had two bad stators on this machine, but thankfully the stator behind the flywheel does seem to be working, because when testing direct, we got just over 30 volts output. So the good news is we don't need to take anything apart there, but likely we do need to replace this voltage regulator when the time comes. But I've seen enough for now, so let's spin this thing around, get the generator off, and remove the engine from the frame. And if possible, I need to get this bracket out completely, because there isn't really any clearance up above to pull the stator out. So we actually need to drop it down a bit so that we can slide it out once these bolts are removed. So I've just been spending a minute kind of looking this over, trying to see visually where the failure occurred. And initially I wasn't seeing anything. The lacing is all intact. It looks to be in good shape. It's like that on both sides. The copper is a good color. But if you look at these slots down here where the insulating paper is, those look pretty good. But if we pan over here, there's a few that do look a little bit crispy. So I'm thinking likely that is where the failure occurred. It's a pretty nice setup here that we have these two loops right here to hoist the engine out of the frame. A lot of generators don't have that. A lot of them, even if they did, wouldn't fit out of the top. But this one did just barely squeak out. Anyway, let's leave this for now. Let's get the other machine up on the lift and find out why that one isn't making any power. And this NorthStar looks basically brand new. I don't think it was used a whole lot before the generator stopped producing power. And Dana, not the first Dana, but the second Dana, actually picked this up as a project machine. He is an electrician. He thought he could go through it and fix the problem, or at least identify what the problem was. So he did everything I would have done, and even a little bit more. And yet this generator still doesn't make power. So, I'm thinking let's start where we did on the other machine. We'll check the oil, get the engine up and running, and just validate its current state. And it looks like we have plenty of oil. It's filled right to there, which is the full mark. So we are good, at least on the oil front. And I think we'll do the same thing on this one. We'll just tap in right here. The tank is empty, but there is still a little bit of fuel in the line, and this is feeding right into the fuel pump. So we'll disconnect it there, connect the test tank, and we should be ready to fire this up. Actually, I'm going to drain that filter out. The fuel in there smells pretty old. So with this one, I'm going to do the easy thing here. Use the electric start. Place your bets. Is the engine going to start, and are we going to have any output? So I've got a light plugged in and turned on. I've also got this multimeter connected to one of the 120 outs. So when the engine starts, we'll see what, if anything, we get as far as the main output goes on the generator. And we also have this multimeter here. This is connected to the battery. We're starting at about 13 volts. So when the engine started, I want to see if the charging system works on this machine. I cranked the engine just a bit to kind of prime the system. Should be ready to go. So no issues with that engine. It started right up, choke was off, it was running nice and smooth, and the stator behind the flywheel, it is working, so is the power regulator, and the battery was charging at the proper voltage. As far as the generator itself goes, we got very little out of it. The light did not light up, and according to this meter, we were only producing about half a volt. So yeah, there is something wrong for sure. So let's dig in and see if we can't figure out where the problem is. So everything we need to test on this machine is right on top of the generator. There is normally a cover that goes on top, but that was removed when I picked it up. But I do have it, so we can put it back on, assuming we get to that point. Anyway, it's going to be very hard to show you what's going on. Lucky for us, I have the stator from the other NorthStar, which I know is good. And you can see now kind of what we're dealing with. We have two capacitors, and all the wiring from the stator comes up to this wiring block. We have the two neutrals, which are connected with this bus bar, and we also have a connection here over to ground. So this is neutral bonded. We also have leg 1 and leg 2. The live wire is right there. So I'm thinking, before we test this one, let's test one that is a known good, find out exactly what the values are, and then we'll do the same test on this machine. So we know from the test we just did that the stator on that other machine over there isn't trying to power up. So I don't think the issue is with the stator. It's likely with the DPE windings or the excitation system. So this is a brushless machine. There are no brushes. Instead, it's driven by these two capacitors. So the fact that it wasn't trying to power up tells me either we lost residual magnetism, these capacitors are bad, the DPE windings are bad, or potentially the rotor is bad. So I'm going to start here with the capacitors and the DPE winding. So we'll get these disconnected. And just take note, capacitors, they do store power and they discharge rapidly. So don't assume they're discharged, although they should be in this case, but let's just make sure. And that one appears to be safe. And it's also hard to believe that this is the good stator because it is pretty rusted and corroded, but it definitely works. And that one, I think I unplugged earlier. Okay, we are all discharged. So I'm going to start by testing the DPE winding. Now, this is interesting that we have two different color wires. Usually there's only one DPE winding. Sometimes these capacitors are wired in parallel and other times in series. So I'm not sure if that's what is going on here or if potentially we have two separate circuits. So we will check that in a minute. So it looks like 1.3 ohms on the red circuit. Let's check the green. And about the same, 1.4, 1.3. And let's just check it from green to red, see if there's any connection between them. And no, it doesn't appear that there is. So these are two separate windings, I would say, in the stator. Yeah, no connection between them. And then we can check these to ground. We know these are good because they actually work, but we'll check it anyway just to make sure. And yeah, so at least on this one, DPE winding appears to be good, but we kind of knew that because this one works. So let's just check the health of these capacitors real quick. They're rated at 31.5 microfarad each, plus or minus 5%. So we should see something close to the 31.5. And this one's at 30, which seems reasonable. Let's check the other. 30.3. So let's do the same tests on the other stator. So let's get the green and the red wires disconnected from these capacitors. And Dana did replace these. These are new, but let's start by testing them, and then we'll check the DPE windings. $30.7. That one's good. And 30.7. So they're both good. And we'll check the resistance now on these windings. We'll start with the green one. On the other machine, we were at 1.3 about on each of these. 1.3, 1.4, that seems good. Check it to ground. No issues there. And we'll check the red. And we're at 0.5, 0.4. So that actually is pretty low. You know, we had 1.3 on the other machine. So that is a significant difference. Let's check it to ground. No fault. And let's check it to the other DPE. And no fault. So that is very suspicious. You know, that reading, it's too low. We did a low voltage test with this meter to ground and didn't find any problems on the red DPE winding, but I'm thinking there likely is a problem there since the resistance is so low. So now I'm going to do a high voltage Megger test. We'll start at 500 volts. We have one lead connected to the red and the other one is connected to ground. So we'll give that a go. If it passes, we'll up the voltage. And assuming it's still good, you know, we'll try checking for shorts to adjacent windings like the other DPE or possibly one of the main legs. So starting at 500 volts, when I crank this handle, what we want to see is that the resistance is high in the 500 plus mega ohm range. If I turn the handle and it goes to the right, that would indicate a short. So let's see what we get. And that is good. We got 500 mega ohms at 500 volts. Let's try it at 1,000. Still good. So there is no short to ground. So let me move the ground lead over to the other DPE winding. We'll try this again. All right, let's try this again from the red to the green DPE winding. Insulation seems good at 500 volts. And it's still good at 1,000 volts. So let's move the lead again over to the main legs. Okay, and now we're on actually leg 1 and leg 2 because they are jumpered together and it's actually still bonded to ground. So this is kind of an unnecessary test because we already checked for a short to ground and we didn't see it. And yeah, still no short. So it's very interesting that the red DPE winding is so much lower on this machine. So I just double checked my work on this red DPE winding just to make sure that the reading I saw before was consistent. And it is. You know, we're getting 0.3 to 0.4 ohms, which doesn't sound like a lot, but I also double checked this and they should both be 1.3. So there is definitely something wrong with that red DPE winding. And although we didn't find a short to ground or a short to another winding, you know, potentially it's internally shorted to itself. So I'm not saying 100% that's it, but I am fairly certain that is the problem. That said, though, we can still test leg 1 and leg 2. So let's break the jumper connection to ground, and then we can check the health of those as well. I'm noticing we do have an extra wire here. There's supposed to be 4 coming down from the control panel, 2 black, a green, and a white. And we do have an extra green, which I think Dana ran during his troubleshooting. So that should be fine to leave there. But for now, what we're interested in is removing this jumper from neutral to ground. It's nice too. We put all new hardware in here. He even double nutted all these connections so there's no chance of them backing off. I think I pointed this out earlier, but we do have a metal bus bar connecting leg 1 and leg 2 on the neutral side. You need that because that'll put each of the legs in series, and that's how you get the 240 volts. And when disconnecting this jumper wire to ground, I noticed we don't have that bus bar on this setup. So likely that was removed during Dana's troubleshooting. Without it, it should still produce 120 volts, but you would not get 240. Anyway, let's check leg 1 and leg 2, see what the resistance is at, and we'll check it to ground. So we'll start with this leg right here. It should connect either to here or over to there. And usually 0.3 to 0.5 ohms is considered good. In this case, we're 0.2, 0.3, so a little bit low, potentially. So let's check the other leg, make sure it's a consistent reading with the first one. And we're at 0.2, 0.1. So that's actually very low because the resistance of these leads is 0.1. And if we're measuring 0.1, that is almost a short circuit. So that is also not a good sign. Let's check it to ground. And there's not a ground fault. So let's check leg 1 and leg 2 on the good stator. So let's check leg 1. Now technically we should break this bus bar. So if we do get a fault, we should isolate leg 1 from leg 2. But right now it is isolated from ground. So we're just checking really the resistance on each leg. And we'll check if there's a ground fault. If there is, we'll have to break that link and figure out which one is bad. So on leg 1, we have 0.2 ohms, 0.1, 0.2. So actually pretty similar to what we saw on the other stator. And we'll check leg 2. We should see pretty much the same thing. And we do. 0.1, 0.2. We'll check it to ground. And no ground fault. I wouldn't say we have a smoking gun on this one, but we do have a prime suspect. The resistance value on this DPE winding, it's too low. It's at 0.3 ohms. It should be at 1.3. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but on a DPE winding, that could make all the difference. So although I have another stator and rotor that we could both swap onto this machine and it should work, I'm thinking let's just swap the stator out. I'm fairly certain that is the problem. And if we just swap one part at a time, then we'll know for sure which part was bad. I ended up pulling the battery back out. I don't want there to be any chance of this engine turning over while I'm working on it. And I was going to get the battery box out of the way as well, just to give me a little bit more space. Unfortunately, this one is riveted in place, which is actually a great idea. But I think for now, we do need to drill those out to get the space we need. It looks like this wire was passed through and then the terminals crimped on, so we can't actually remove it without cutting the terminals off, which I don't really want to do. So I'm thinking instead, we can probably just unscrew the ground right there, also drill that rivet out, and that should allow me to move the box out of the way. Before we get that stator out, we do need to disconnect the wires. We could do it down there on the wire block on the stator, but given the limited space and visibility, I think it would be a lot easier if we remove these 4 bolts and disconnect the wires on the control panel side. So we have 5 wires coming in. We have 2 right here to this main breaker. This is leg 1 and leg 2. We have the neutral and the ground coming into the 50 amp. And then we have, it looks like another neutral wire. And that is connected right to the rest of the outlets. So yeah, it looks like what he did here was he ran dedicated wires to the 50 amp plug, at least on the neutral and the ground side, which is fine. And then the original ground and neutrals are feeding these outlets over here. So we actually have a total of 6 wires we need to disconnect. And to get these screws out to release the wires, we actually have to remove the screws on the front and pull this breaker out. And that was stripping out. And that one's gonna too. Let's attack this from the back side. Well, we've got 4 wires out, 2 to go. This ground wire is just held on with a nut, easy enough. The neutral, though, is going to be a bit of a problem. This connector, it's not removable. You got to cut it out, and that's not something I want to do. So this just turned into a lot more work because I need to remove the neutral now from each of these outlets. And to do that, I actually need to remove all the hardware holding them in place. So yeah, let's get the ground out. We'll flip this panel back up, remove all the hardware, and then finally get the neutral wires removed. And we're getting pretty close. Just these 2 bolts holding the stator down, and then we have 4 bolts, 1 in each corner. And once those are removed, the stator should slide right out. And we'll put a little bit of PB Blaster here. It might help release the bearing from the end housing. And we'll just use a puller and pull gently. Hopefully it separates. But you don't want to pull too hard. You could easily break this aluminum. And that's a lot of force. I'm not going to apply any more. I'm just going to tap the other side with a dead blow hammer, see if we can't break the seal. Well, the rotor visually looks to be in pretty good shape. And you can probably tell this has a twist in it. It's kind of twisted to the right. And rotors that are shaped like this, they do produce low THD. So this is definitely a good machine to save. And usually rotors don't fail, but the connections do, usually to the slip rings. Since this is brushless, we don't have that connection to the slip rings, but we do have a connection to a diode on each side. And those connections look to be intact. You know, potentially the diode or diodes went bad, but usually that's not the case. And based on the tests we did earlier, you know, I'm willing to bet swapping that other stator on will fix this problem. So we've got both stators here. The one that works is on the left, and the one we just pulled off on the right. For the most part, I think I'm going to leave a lot of this stuff behind. You know, I think I will steal these capacitors. They tested well, and they're fairly new, whereas these are likely original to the machine. So we'll get the capacitors moved over as well as the wire harness, and then we'll bolt this one up and try it out. So I've decided to stick with the original wire harness that came with the Stator. You know, the wires aren't quite as heavy of a gauge, but you know, it is a better fit on the terminals, and I don't think it's going to cause a problem. So we'll get this connected. I guess one thing to keep in mind is that Dana did add a couple meters to the cover that goes on here. Each meter is connected to a leg, and it's going to show volts and amps. So we also have to wire these up as well as the leads that run up to the control panel. So let's start with the leads. And we also need to put these current clamps on them for the meters. So we'll start with this one. I'm going to leave everything kind of loose for now. Once all the wires are connected, we'll get everything better situated and then tighten it down. And actually, I'm going to leave the nuts off because we also need to connect up the meters. So I will situate it like that. And we will connect these wires. So we need a power for each leg. And the meter on the right, we'll just pick up the negative from the ground since it's bonded to neutral. I forgot a current clamp on this guy. Oopsie. Not a big deal. And we'll get the current clamps plugged in. Each meter has a lead coming out of it. Just clicks in like that. it took a lot of work, but we are back together, at least enough to do a quick test. I'm going to leave the covers off for now until I know that we're making power. The stator has been reattached to the bell housing, and the stator is also attached to the mount right here. The control panel, we're not going to connect for now, so I've capped off the live wires and we'll just kind of leave them out of the way. The real indicator here is going to be these 2 meters. We have one on each leg, so when this engine starts, my hope is that both of these illuminate and indicate 120 volts. So let's crank the engine and see what we get. All right, here goes nothing. Contact. I've got to admit, I was a little bit nervous about this one, and not just because of the dangling live wires. We tested the other stator, we found something suspicious, but it wasn't clearly bad. So we swapped it out anyway. We're using the same rotor, the same capacitors, and this time it powered right up. Both of these meters lit up, about 125 volts on each leg. So we are back in business. So let's finish getting this together, and we'll get it outside and try it out. So I just spent a second, I reconnected the neutral wires and resecured the outlets. So the control panel, it is more or less ready to go. But one thing I noticed, and I think Dana noticed that too, because Dana ran 2 ground wires up to this control panel, and the OEM panel only ran 1 right to this 50 amp outlet. The other outlets are all grounded right here to this metal plate. And my assumption was that these 2 points were electrically connected, the ground lug to the ground terminal. And there's actually no connection between the 2. So what Dana did was he ran a second wire right to here, and this is electrically connected on this outlet to the ground terminal. So by doing that, he provided a good ground for all the outlets. So the OEM setup was not good. And, I'm running 1 wire, but to compensate, I made this jumper wire, which is going to jump over from the ground lug on the 50 amp to this wire terminal, which will distribute it to the rest of the outlets. So everything is done. At least I think it is. You know, assuming we did the wiring correct. So I do want to start it again real quick. This time we do have a light plugged into each leg. Those lights are turned on. And we also have the multimeter plugged into the 240. So I want to make sure that everything is working as it should. Well, here goes nothing. Well, I think we're looking pretty good. Both those lights turned on, so we know leg 1 and leg 2 are working, and that's also confirmed on the 240 out. We had about 251 volts, so this machine, it is fully functional. So let's roll it outside, we'll plug it into the load bank and see what exactly it can do. I think it's go time. I've got the external tank connected as well as the load bank, and the generator is ready to go. Now, my expectations for this are pretty high. You know, this is a very good engine. It's mated with a very good generator. And I actually misspoke earlier. This is not rated at 8,000 watts. It is actually rated at 8,500 watts. Now, this is supposed to be low THD, and I'm hoping we're going to see 6% or less. You know, most non-inverter generators, they actually top out at about 20%. So anything in that 6% range would be really good. So let's get the engine started. We'll let it warm up a bit. And assuming things look good, we'll start to bring on the load. All right, so far so good. The engine started without any issue and it's running nice and smooth. Without a load, we're starting pretty low at 4.5% THD. And the sine wave, not as clean as I had hoped for, but I have seen quite a bit worse. So let's start by bringing on a 4,000 watt load. That's 2,000 watts, 4,000 watts. Everything seems good. And under approximately a half load, THD didn't change a whole lot. We're at 4.7%, and the sine wave cleaned up just a bit. So I'm going to give it a couple minutes. Assuming everything looks good, we'll go for its rated load of 8,500 watts. No issues pulling 4,000 watts. So let's add another 2,000 watts. So now we're at 6,000, 8,000, 8,500. So we're at the max rated load, and under that kind of a load, the THD barely came up. We're at 5%, so that is very good. And the sine wave looks about the same. So we'll give this a few minutes, assuming it holds. Might try bumping it up just a little bit more. So no issues at all pulling its rated load at 8,500 watts. That said though, you can tell we're getting close to the limit. You know, the voltage is starting to come down. We're at 122 volts, and so is the engine speed. but I think it has a little bit left in it. So let's try adding another 500 watts. So now we're at 9,000, and under that kind of a load, still the same THD. So let's swap that, and we'll put 9,000 back on. Let's try 9,500. It's doing it, although it's really close to being out of power, and the THD actually went down. That is absolutely amazing. So let's take the load off, we'll let things cool down, and then we'll shut it down. I'm noticing now that the engine's warmed up, the no-load speed has also come up a bit to 63 Hertz. I'm going to bring that down, then I think we'll be good to shut it down. So I am pretty impressed with this machine. This is one of the top low THD machines I have tested, at least the non-inverter types. You know, the beauty of this machine is that there are basically no electronics. You just have the run capacitor, a good engine, and a good generator. And we just pulled 1,000 watts over its rated, and the THD was only 4.9%. So this might be the best non-inverter generator I have ever tested, at least on the THD front. I think the only other two that come to mind are the Generac XG10000 and that GenPro one we did a few years ago with the same V-twin Vanguard engine. So yeah, this machine, I might keep it. You know, it's not often I get one that's worthy, and this one I think might be. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.